It was an era where vows were sacred and the consequences for breaking them were unforgiving. In the medieval world, faith was not just a path to salvation, it was a prison from which there was no escape. Imagine a nun cloistered away from the world, dedicating herself to God's service. The very air she breathed was meant to be pure, untouched by earthly desires. But what if she were to falter? What if she gave in to temptation, broke her sacred vows and was cast into the unrelenting arms of a brutal fate? The consequences were not merely spiritual, they were physical, unimaginable, and beyond anything most could endure. In this video, we delve into the chilling world of medieval nuns who broke their vows and the terrifying fate that awaited them. If you enjoyed dark histories that reveal the untold tragedies of the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. There's so much more to uncover. To truly understand the punishments that awaited those who dared to break their vows, we first have to understand the lives these women led. From their very first steps into the convent, they were taught to surrender everything to God. Their lives became an unbroken chain of ritual, prayer, and penance. But behind these high stone walls, behind the soft rustle of habit, there were human beings, a side of the story often ignored. What would drive them to betray the sacred oaths they had sworn to uphold? What sins could be so tempting, so irresistible, that they would push these women into an unforgivable act? In this video, we step into the daily life of a medieval nun, the sights, the sounds, and the suffocating isolation, the deep yearning for freedom, the cold stone walls and the echoes of the past that haunted every prayer. We begin to ask, what was it like to live under such strict devotion? And what could possibly happen when a nun's faith wavered? But temptation has a way of finding even the most isolated souls. The vow of chastity, the vow of obedience, the vow of poverty were not just spiritual commitments, they were lifelines. For many, life inside the convent became a cold, suffocating space where every thought, every feeling was under constant surveillance. When desires, whether forbidden love, lust, or simple rebellion crept in, the consequences were no longer just theological, but mortal. In this video, we explored the forbidden acts that could lead to a nun's downfall. The act of breaking a vow was seen as an unforgivable sin, a blasphemous betrayal of the sacred bond. But what kind of punishment awaited those who committed these unthinkable acts? Was there mercy? Or did the Church mete out brutal justice, casting these women into a fate worse than death itself? The heavy, oppressive silence of the convent was all-consuming. The air within the stone walls carried the scent of incense and age, thick with the weight of centuries of prayer. Every corner, every corridor seemed to whisper of devotion, of sacrifice. To the outside world, nuns were the epitome of piety, living lives devoted entirely to God. Their days were marked by the rhythmic chanting of psalms, the unfaltering disciplines of prayer, and the quiet, unwavering faith that bound them to the walls of their cloistered existence. But what was life really like behind those walls? The convent, meant to be a sanctuary from the distractions of the world, was both a refuge and a prison. These women, young, often barely into adulthood, entered the convent full of hope, seeking salvation through devotion. Some were drawn by religious conviction, but others were there by the demands of their families, sometimes even as a form of punishment for a past mistake. For many, it was a lifetime of total surrender to a higher calling. But for others, it became a place of sorrow, of regret, and of a quiet, desperate yearning for freedom.
A life inside the convent was one of absolute submission. The rules were harsh, and the punishments for breaking them were severe. Yet in this suffocating order, human nature still found a way to make itself known. The young women who entered the convent were expected to put aside everything: earthly desires, family, identity, even their very names. Once inside, they became nothing more than brides of Christ, wearing plain habits that covered their bodies and their pasts. The vows they took, chastity, poverty, and obedience, were not just promises, but chains. To break them was not only to violate the sacred, but to betray the very structure that held the world together. The days were long, filled with endless prayers, hours spent in contemplation and worship. Their bodies became weary from the rigorous routine, their minds dull from the lack of human connection. But it wasn't just the physical toll that burdened them. The emotional toll was far heavier. The deep loneliness of their existence gnawed at them in ways they couldn't put into words. Without the distractions of the outside world, no relationships, no worldly pleasures, how could they keep themselves from craving the very things they had been taught to renounce? Yet there were no escapes, not even in the deepest corners of the convent where silence was the loudest noise and the weight of a vow felt as solid as the stone walls that enclosed them. Some found solace in their faith, in the idea that this was their path to salvation. But for others, doubt slowly crept in. The walls of their world became a reflection of the prison they were trapped in. What happens when a person, no matter how devout, is denied the very essence of their humanity? The ability to love, to touch, to feel the simple joys of life. It was this crushing isolation that led to the tragedies we remember today. A woman, bound by oath, may have found herself longing for something more than what the convent could offer. She could have fallen prey to the seduction of forbidden love, or perhaps the haunting memory of a lost life outside the walls, an existence she had been forced to leave behind. Or perhaps it was simply the yearning for freedom that led her to question everything she had been taught. But to question was the first sin. To look beyond the sacred walls, to even dare to wish for the outside world, was to invite disaster. Temptation, the Church would argue, was the devil's whisper, trying to tear the soul away from its heavenly path. In the end, the convents did not allow for weakness, for doubt. To falter, even for a moment, was to risk damnation, not just for the soul, but for the body too. The life of a nun in the medieval era was one of intense discipline and devotion, but it was also one of unimaginable sacrifice. The pain of isolation, the constant pressure to conform, and the never-ending demands of faith created an environment ripe for human suffering. For those who struggled under the weight of these vows, the temptation to break free must have felt unbearable. But the price for such a break was not one most could comprehend. The act of breaking a vow, any vow, is no small matter. In the context of a medieval nun, this was an act of defiance against the very will of God. The vows these women swore to uphold were not mere formalities, they were chains that bound them to a life of rigid obedience. The vow of chastity, the vow of poverty, the vow of obedience, these were not just promises to God, they were the foundation of their existence. To break them was to turn your back not only on God, but on the very life you had chosen. It was the ultimate betrayal, the severing of the bond between the sacred and the earthly.
But temptation, as it does with all, finds its way. In the quiet, shadowed corners of the convent, human nature lingered, unresolved and raw. The vow of chastity, perhaps the most difficult for many, was the one that most often fell. Young women, pulled from their homes, often before they could even understand the true weight of their decision, found themselves in a place where human affection was forbidden. Love, the very thing that makes us human, was something they were told to suppress, to bury deep within themselves. But love doesn't disappear so easily. It grows in the most forbidden spaces,
quietly taking root until it consumes everything. For some nuns, this love manifested in the form of a forbidden relationship, one that could be sparked by a fleeting glance, a whispered conversation, or the simplest touch. In an environment where affection was stripped from them, any form of human connection, whether it was tender or sensual, was an act of rebellion. It was a yearning for something more, something beyond the cold austerity of convent life. These relationships were illicit, dangerous, and filled with dread. If discovered, they would bring ruin. But it wasn't always love. The simple desire for freedom, for the experience of life outside the stone walls, could drive a nun to break her vows. The thought of walking outside, feeling the sun on her skin, hearing the sounds of life beyond the cloister, such a thought was intoxicating to the soul that had been caged for so long. Yet even these simple desires could lead to betrayal. The pull of the world, with its colors, its smells, its sounds, became too powerful for some to resist. A brief escape into the streets, a glance at a passerby, could turn into something far darker. And once that line had been crossed, there was no going back. When a nun was caught in such acts, the consequences were severe, in often unimaginable ways. To the medieval church, this wasn't just a breach of vows, it was an affront to God, a shame to the entire religious community. The punishment for breaking such sacred oaths was not a matter of mere moral consequence, it was a matter of life and death. But what form did this punishment take? The Church, with its unyielding hold over society, did not allow for the sins of its clergy to go unpunished. For nuns who broke their vows, the repercussions were often swift and brutal. First came the public shame, being dragged before the community, humiliated for all to see. But shame was the least of their suffering. The ultimate punishment often involved violence, both physical and emotional. The act of punishing a fallen nun wasn't just to bring her back to the fold, it was to ensure that others would never even contemplate the same betrayal. Some nuns were simply expelled from the convent, forced to wander the streets as outcasts, marked by their sin. For many, this exile was as much a death sentence as any execution. With no family, no home, and no means to support themselves, these women often found themselves on the fringes of society, destitute, shunned, and vulnerable to every form of abuse. But not all punishments were so indirect. Some nuns faced far more horrific fates. The Church had long practiced extreme measures when dealing with those who fell from grace. The more extreme the betrayal, the more brutal the punishment. Some nuns were subjected to the iron hands of inquisitors who were relentless in their desire to root out heresy and sin. Torture, a grim and gruesome reality of the time, was used to extract confessions to ensure that the transgressor understood the gravity of her sin. The Church, in its attempts to preserve its purity, saw no other way to cleanse the soul but through such suffering. The darkest punishments, however, were reserved for those who had sinned in the most egregious ways. If a nun was found guilty of breaking her vows in a way that was seen as particularly shameful, such as engaging in sexual relations, the consequences could be nothing short of brutal. Execution was not unheard of. In some cases, nuns were put to death not with the mercy of a quick blow, but in the most public of ways. It was the medieval equivalent of crucifixion, an example to others that even the smallest breach of faith would be met with the severest consequences. In such moments, the brutality of the Church's rule became undeniable. The very institution that promised salvation could also wield such monstrous power over the lives of those it claimed to protect. The punishment for breaking a vow was not only a question of guilt, but of control. To punish a fallen nun was to remind all others that the Church was untouchable, that to question it, to To rebel against its authority was to risk not only damnation, but a fate far worse than death. But what did these punishments say about the medieval church's view of women? Were they seen as nothing more than instruments to maintain purity, or were they human beings capable of mistakes and yearning? And what did it mean for those who faced such horrific consequences for a simple human desire to break free from the confines of their existence? In the end, the fate of those nuns who dared to break their sacred vows serves as a tragic reminder of the harsh realities of the medieval world, where the lines between faith, punishment, and power were drawn in blood. Behind the veil of piety and devotion, there existed a terrifying force, one that sought to crush any rebellion, no matter how small. These women were not just victims of their own desires, but of an institution that demanded unwavering obedience, often at the cost of their very humanity. The punishments they faced, ranging from exile and public humiliation to torture and death, were not merely acts of retribution, they were lessons to all. The medieval church, in its relentless pursuit of purity, showed that even the slightest deviation from its path could lead to a brutal end. It was a world where suffering and silence were expected, where the most basic human emotions were seen as sins. And yet, in the shadows of the cloister, human nature always found a way to break through, no matter the cost. These women, often forgotten by history, paid the ultimate price for their moments of rebellion, for their desire to feel alive beyond the cold stone walls of the convent. Their stories may be lost to time, but their suffering, their choices, and their courage echo through the ages, reminding us of the dark side of religious devotion and the terrifying consequences of breaking free from its grasp. Thank you for watching. If this video resonated with you, please like and subscribe to continue exploring these haunting stories from our past. The struggle for freedom, for identity, and for a voice was never easy, and it is through understanding these dark histories that we begin to appreciate how far we have come and how far we still have to go.